Give me your iPhone.
Why? What are you gonna do? Venmo my life savings?
If you had savings, we wouldn't be here. Now hand it over.
What's that? Some kind of magic anti-hacker bag?
Something like that. You're also gonna need this.
Electrical tape? What for?
For the camera in your car. You think just because you don't FaceTime the CIA, they're not watching? Every smart device is a surveillance tool, and trust me, someone's always watching. Now tape the goddamn camera.
Next you'll tell me I need to unplug my toaster.
You should.
You are listening to The Lockdown, the practical privacy and security podcast. Welcome back and Happy New Year. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to thank everyone who supports this show through Patreon. That's over at patreon.com/The Lockdown. I'll make sure to add a link in the show notes, but your support keeps this show running, and also my distaste for ads, which means we don't have to endure that, so for that I thank you. So in this week's show, let's do a recap and some thoughts on 2025 and also where we are heading. Now, the title of this show is The State of Privacy in 2025, but really the main thought is, are we winning or losing? So I'm going to give you some updates and my thoughts there. Then we'll dive into some privacy regulations that are coming in across various states in the US. We'll talk about Apple privacy, they've been in the news, as well as AI and voice and home assistants, electric cars, and then we'll finish off talking about cybersecurity and privacy. Okay, so it's a new year, and I've been reflecting on how much has changed, not just in the world of privacy, but in how I approach it personally and professionally. It's been a ride, and as I sit here thinking about what's next, I can't help but feel both a mix of optimism, but also frustration. One of the things I've been working on recently is psysecure.com. That's my website. So it's psysecure.com. And this is where I host the show notes, my blogs. I've got some OSINT tools on there, but I've also redesigned the site to look a bit more professional. Now, as before, there are no cookies, there are no databases, just clean, static HTML and JavaScript. So it's been a fun project to work on over the holidays. I've also been working on tightening up my own digital life. You may think that someone who talks about privacy as much as I do already has everything locked down perfectly, but the truth is, privacy is never a finished project. It's not something you set up once and then forget about. It's a process. It's a constant battle. It's constant maintenance. And I'll tell you, I find it overwhelming at times as well. For example, over the holidays, I decided to go through all my personal email accounts. I did a count, and on simple login alone, I have 500 email aliases for various purposes. I decided it was time to do some housekeeping, and what a mess. Old subscriptions I'd forgotten about, services I hadn't used in years, accounts tied to emails I barely remember creating, and all of this really is a reminder of just how much digital debris, if you want to put it that way, we leave behind. Luckily, they're all in alias names, but still, it was a mess. So I started the pruning, deleting old accounts where I could, updating passwords for those accounts I want to keep, and even setting up a couple of new aliases. It was tedious, but it felt good and it was necessary. Now, another thing I've been thinking about is how I use technology day to day. I actually had an email from a listener who was discussing access to photos. And it wasn't so much for him, but also his family, and we share a similar concern. I have set up quite the system. It's not perfect, but when I take a photo with my GrapheneOS phone, Nextcloud on there backs that up to my Nextcloud server into a photos folder, and then it has a folder for each year, and then it subdivides that into a folder for each month. Now that's great for me, but it's not very easy for me to provide access to my wife and kids. They do use Nextcloud, but we're looking at about 370 gig of photos. And by the way, that's not just for my phone. I have photography that I've been collecting over decades, all in that same folder. So what I decided to do was install Photo Prism. I actually use SyncThing on my PC, and that takes a copy of that photos folder onto my SyncThing virtual machine. Photo Prism is installed on there, and that indexes everything. So that's also a backup. They're on two different storage arrays. One's on Nextcloud, one's on SyncThing, two different sets of hardware. And then on the latter, Photo Prism indexes everything. And that's something I can provide locally. I think I mentioned this before. I basically gave the link to my wife and kids. They can add it to their iPhone home screen. They still use iPhones. I'm not going to convince them to use GrapheneOS, but it essentially appears like an app. What they then do is download family photos and videos, and then it backs up to iCloud. So they have a safe copy. Is it ideal? No, it's not, but it's the best solution I could come up with the limited time I had. Now, I've gone back to carrying my GrapheneOS phone full time again. Now, I do carry an iPad with me when I travel, but that's always in aeroplane mode anyway. And I use that mainly when I'm going to connect to Wi-Fi. Obviously, I have VPN on there, Proton VPN, and then I use it for YouTube, reading, and some apps that aren't supported on my GrapheneOS phone. Honestly, though, if I were on the more extreme end of privacy, I wouldn't be using YouTube at all. I'd use an alternative. But my Google account that I use that for has an alias name. I have no Google services running on my phone, so I'm not too concerned. That's the balance I take. Now, on the professional side, I've been busy building out a consulting business under the Secure brand. Now, for a long time, I've been focused on cybersecurity, but also privacy advocacy, helping individuals with advice. But over the past year, I've seen a real need for practical security and privacy advice for small businesses, small and medium businesses. Now, these organisations just don't have the resources of a large enterprise, but they still face many of the same threats. So that's ransomware, scams, social engineering attacks, just to name a few. And let's be honest, some of the most damaging breaches we've seen recently haven't been because of a lack of investment in cybersecurity. Even companies that pour millions of dollars into their cybersecurity defences are still getting hit. Why? Because they're not focusing on the right things. Just before the holidays, I had a potential client reach out to me. They were a small company, and unfortunately for them, they were scammed, or their customers were. A threat actor had registered a domain name which looked incredibly similar to theirs. So let's just say, and it's not this, but I'm going to make it up. Let's say it was foodandgraincommercial.com. Well, the threat actor registered foodandgraincommercials.com with an S on the end. Looks almost identical. And I'll say threat actor, we might as well call them a scammer. They sent a PDF document to all of this organisation's customers saying the bank details had been updated. Please pay future invoices using these new bank details. It was a bank in the United States, but the threat actor in this case was based out of India, and over $500,000 was paid, not a small amount. And it got me thinking, a lot of the things we do in our personal lives for privacy and security aren't being done by organisations. So when I talked to this potential client, I said, look, let's just start from the beginning and let's learn some lessons from this. First of all, their invoices were being sent from various employees' email addresses, not a specific email. So that should be a red flag for customers. If you pre-agreed that all invoices are going to be sent from, let's say it's procurement8741@companyname.com, that's pretty unique. You're not going to be using that email address online anywhere. It's not going to be used for accounts. It's probably not going to end up on haveibeenpwned.com. And if it does, you can change that every year. But that's something you can discuss with your customers up front and say, if you have any request to change bank details and it's not from this email address, that is a red flag. But the other thing, of course, is to limit who can send invoices within the organisation. In their case, they're a small company and it was pretty much anybody could initiate an invoice from the system. That shouldn't be the case. You should limit that to a few trusted individuals. And it's not because you don't trust the rest of your employees, but in the event of a phishing attack or whatever it may be, that's going to limit the risk. And it does frustrate me that large organisations seem to have the need to have first.last@companyname.com. Why make it so predictable? Surely, if you had, in my case, Ray471@companyname.com, that's harder to guess. Now, sure, it could end up on Have I Been Pwned and data breaches and things, but I would suspect you would reduce the amount of phishing and scam emails and general spam by a significant amount. I'm not going to put a number on it because I don't have the actual statistics, but I would say a significant percentage of emails would be reduced because you can't just guess the email format. And if you're reducing the number of spam emails, you're probably reducing the chances of a phishing attack as well. Anyway, so for my new website, I've adapted the motto of this podcast to my consulting services, and that is cybersecurity does not have to be all or nothing. Small businesses don't have to have an enterprise-scale security operations center or a chief information security officer to protect themselves. What they need is a balanced, tailored approach, something that fits their specific risks, their operations and their budget. And that's where we come in, conducting thorough security assessments, strategic consulting and offering expert guidance to help businesses strengthen their defences in a practical and effective way. Now, it's been quite eye-opening to see how different organisations approach privacy and security. Some of them are ahead of the curve, which is great. They've invested in training, they conduct regular audits, and they're genuinely trying to do right by their customers and employees. But others, and dare I say the majority, let's just say it's a miracle they haven't made headlines yet. What I've noticed across the board is that everyone is feeling the pressure, whether it's from new regulations, customer demands, constant threats of breaches, and organisations are starting to realise that privacy and security now are closely linked together. They're not optional, they're necessities. Now, the reality is smaller businesses are often the most vulnerable. They don't have the luxury of massive security budgets, but that doesn't mean they have to be easy targets. So again, what I'm doing with this podcast and at SciSecure is bridging the gap, helping individuals and organisations implement good security and privacy measures that are effective without being overly complicated or expensive. Now, it's early days, but as we head into 2025, I'm excited about what's next. There's so much to be done, but there's also so much opportunity to make a difference. That said, I've seen a lot of resistance from security teams at various organisations I've been speaking to. Not outright defiance, but more of a passive attitude. This idea that privacy is someone else's problem. They might say, oh, we hired a consultant, we installed some software, so we're good. But also I've been hearing, but we've always done it that way. I even wrote a blog about this titled 10 Things CISOs Could Do Better. Now, for us individuals, privacy is not something we can outsource. At the end of the day, for an organisation and an individual, it has to be part of the culture. It has to be something that we live and breathe every day. Now, personally, I've also been spending more time offline, hence the less frequent episodes. I think that's something a lot of us forget to do. It's so easy to get stuck into screens, whether it's your phone, your laptop, your TV, whatever it is. But there's something incredibly refreshing about stepping away and just focusing on the real world, even just for a few moments. Now, for me, that has meant more time to write my book. It's not security and privacy related, but also more time to read books as well. It's been a great way to reset and remind myself why I care so much about privacy in the first place. Then the podcast, and I can tell you how much this show has meant to me. Really, what started as a way to share my ideas and thoughts has turned into a community, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I get emails and messages from listeners all of the time, and people sharing their own stories, asking questions, or just saying thanks. The emails actually make a huge difference to the show. So if you have a question, ideas for the show, or you want to send a few insults my way, it's lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. And it's these connections that really keep me going, even when the news is bleak in the privacy world, which it hasn't been, to be honest, or when the work feels endless. Just knowing that you are out there and you care about privacy and you also want to make a difference, that's what makes it all worth it. And looking ahead to the rest of 2025, I've got a few things on my mind. First, I want to keep pushing myself to stay informed and stay ahead of the curve. Privacy and security are moving targets, and it's so easy to fall behind if we're not paying attention. But more than that, I want to keep sharing what I learn in a way that's accessible and actionable. So that's this podcast. It's not enough to say, here's a problem. We need to focus on solutions too. And sometimes I need your help with that. So that's where I'm at as we kick off the new year. There is a lot to do, but there's also so much we have already accomplished. Please do not give up on privacy. I've seen so many posts on Reddit with titles like, I'm on the brink of giving up. Okay, I think I should give up. I've reached the limit. And another one said, should I give up on my privacy and just make a Google account so I can use YouTube like a normal person? Okay, let's get the less interesting side out of the way, but it's actually quite important, and that's privacy regulations and what to expect in 2025. Now, most of you listening are in the United States. Now, for those of you in Europe, you have GDPR. That's a General Data Protection Regulation. So you're in luck. But if you're in another region, you might not have any privacy laws whatsoever. Now, in the United States, they are still state-level laws, and they're good. They're steps in the right direction, but they just don't come close to offering the same protections that GDPR provides in the EU. So at least in the US, we do have state regulations. There seems to be some momentum and they're building. They're forcing businesses to rethink how they collect and sell and process personal data. They're giving consumers more tools like the right to access and delete and opt out of this data. And I think they're starting to address some of the more nuanced areas of privacy like profiling and sensitive data. I would love to see a trend towards a universal opt-in mechanism, not just opt-out. But it's early days. Now, the biggest problem is fragmentation. Each state passes its own laws, so businesses are left with a patchwork of regulations to navigate. A company operating in 5 states now has 5 different sets of regulations to confront. This is just inefficient, and it's one of the reasons I really would like to see a federal privacy law for the United States. And the other issue is inconsistency. Some state laws include rights like correcting inaccurate data, while others leave it out. It's better than nothing, but the lack of uniform regulation means that us consumers, just don't have the same protections everywhere, and businesses are going to hit obstacles with this approach as well. And one thing I also worry about here is complacency. With these state laws coming into effect, there's a risk that lawmakers at the federal level are going to say, well, the states are handling it, and then leave it at that. But state laws can't address broader issues like cross-border data flows, global tech giants, national security concerns, and so on. States typically have limited resources, so it's hard for me to imagine them pursuing every violation. Anyway, I did some research on privacy regulations in 2025, and this is what I found. If you are in Delaware, they have the Delaware Personal Data Privacy Act, the DPDPA. It became law, a lot of these I'm going to discuss became law a few years ago, but this actually just took effect on the 1st of January 2025. And it's noteworthy for its scope, because this applies to entities conducting business in Delaware that meet thresholds of 35,000 customers or more, or 10,000 customers if more than 20% of gross revenue is derived from the sale of personal data. Now, the law includes non-profits and educational institutions as well, which is rare but increasingly important because these organisations hold vast amounts of personal data, and Delaware is ensuring that they're just as accountable as other businesses. Now, another unique feature of this new Delaware law is the 60-day cure period for violations, which basically gives organisations a chance to fix issues before penalties are applied. But that does expire after 1 year, so I think the end of December 2025. Iowa Consumer Data Protection Act, that also comes into effect January 1st, 2025, so that's in effect now. And that applies to businesses that control or process personal data of at least 100,000 consumers, or handle data for 25,000 consumers if 50% of gross revenue comes from data sales. Nebraska Data Privacy Act, the NDPA, that also came into effect on the 1st of January. New Hampshire Data Privacy Act, the NHDPA, came into effect 1st of January, very similar to Delaware. New Jersey, apart from all the drones and UFOs flying everywhere, they have a privacy law that comes into effect January 15th, 2025. Its scope, again, similar to the others, applies to businesses handling 100,000 consumers' data. Interestingly, it says excluding payment data, and it targets those handling 25,000 consumers if they get their revenue from personal data sales. And you can research each of these if they apply to you. There's Texas Data Privacy and Security Act. That actually came into effect, I believe it was the 1st of July last year. but a new universal opt-out mechanism becomes mandatory as of the 1st of January this year. The Florida Digital Bill of Rights, that came into effect as well in July last year. That targets large tech companies. There's the Montana Consumer Data Privacy Act. That came into effect in October last year. Oregon Consumer Privacy Act, July last year, that came into effect. Very similar to the others. But you can already see the patchwork I'm talking about. Now, these privacy laws do represent a significant shift in how data is handled in the US. At least it gives individuals more control, and I think it does force businesses to become more accountable. And perhaps it does set the stage for future federal legislation. We'll see. I don't think it's time for us privacy advocates to celebrate just yet, but still, it's a critical step. Now, I also want to talk about something else that keeps coming up. Just how private is the iPhone? Well, if you've been watching the news, you would have heard over the past few days of a $95 million settlement with Apple over Siri recording private conversations and sharing them with third parties. This is a prime example of why I push so hard for alternative solutions like GrapheneOS, and even why I advise against using any voice assistants at all. That includes home assistants. Now, let's start with Apple. For years, they've marketed themselves as the privacy-first tech giant. Even their slogan, "What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone," just feels like a cruel joke at this point, after all the lawsuits, including this one. Now, in this case, Apple's Siri assistant recorded conversations and shared that data with third parties. But it's not just Apple. This is not an isolated case. Amazon, they face similar legal challenges concerning its Alexa voice assistant. June 2023, they agreed to pay a $25 million civil penalty to the FTC over allegations that it violated children's privacy laws. The FTC said that Amazon's Alexa service retained children's voice recordings and geolocation data for years, even when parents asked to delete them. Thereby it breached COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And COPPA, in my opinion, is woefully inadequate. Let's say someone parked a car outside of an elementary school and they rigged the car with cameras all around, and it recorded children going to school, at playtime, coming home, walking across the parking lot and so on. Well, that would be outrage. But electric vehicles and most vehicles now have cameras that record all the time. But that isn't in violation of COPPA because it's implied that it's a public space and parents given consent for that child to be out in public. I think it's ridiculous. But anyway, moving on. Now, as in May 2023, Amazon agreed to pay $5.8 million in customer refunds for privacy violations with its Ring doorbell cameras. So all these cases highlight the concerns about data collection practices of voice assistants and smart home devices. And it really emphasises the need for users, all of us, to be vigilant about privacy. All right, GrapheneOS. I've talked a lot about GrapheneOS in the past, particularly in episode 3 and episode 11. Now, if you're new to the show or unfamiliar with GrapheneOS, in summary, it's a custom Android operating system designed for maximum privacy and security. It's what I carry every day, and it's what I recommend. Now, what Graphene does, unlike iOS or stock Android, GrapheneOS does not collect data about how you use the device. There's no tracking, there's no profiling, there's no telemetry. And the security settings is highly customizable. You can control everything for each individual app, whether it has network access, whether you want to block an app from accessing the microphone. All of that is easy enough to do. If you need to prevent a program from using your location, easy, permission denied. Now, as you know, iOS is deeply integrated with the Apple ecosystem. GrapheneOS is similarly deeply integrated with the Pixel hardware, which is a Google phone. That said, it does not run Google. It's a de-Google device. It basically lets you run the phone without ever needing a Google account or any Google services. You can if you want, but that's not the design of GrapheneOS. You control what goes on the device and what doesn't. And I'd also say that I really like the community and the transparency of GrapheneOS. It's open source, which means the code is up for inspection by anybody, And if you contrast this with Apple, you are literally just asked to trust a black box system, which has proved not to be very trustworthy at all. And then one of the other features I really like with GrapheneOS, which would have come in handy with a news article I read recently, I'll share that in a moment, is the duress pin. Now, GrapheneOS provides users with the ability to set a duress pin or password that will irreversibly wipe the device along with any installed eSIMs. So once you enter this pin anywhere on the device where credentials are requested, so for example on the lock screen, it will completely erase the eSIM and the device. And the news article I saw the other day was of Richard Medhurst, who was a reporter, a journalist, that was arrested and now under investigation under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of 2000. Surprise, surprise, this is the United Kingdom. I'm so glad I got out of there. Now, the UK police have sought to obtain the passwords to his phones, including his GrapheneOS phone. And if the UK authorities prevail, that really means that no journalist travelling to the UK will be safe any longer when it comes to the protection of their sources. Now, if Apple's privacy or lack of frustrates you, GrapheneOS is the solution. Now, had Richard set up a duress pin, he could quite have easily have given the police the duress pin and it would have wiped the device. Now, the problem with Apple's ecosystem is their entire business model is based on locking you in to the ecosystem. So that's iCloud, the App Store accounts, iMessage, FaceTime, Apple Pay, Find My Device, all of that. In fact, you can't even install apps from the App Store until you log in. Now, all of these services are designed to keep you tied to their product. Siri is no different. Now, sure, it can be convenient, but it's also a data collection tool masquerading as a feature. Now, here's the sticking point for me. Even if you disable Siri's features, how can you be sure that it's truly off? This lawsuit was saying that it was recording people while they weren't even using Siri. I'm not sure if that meant disabled or they just had it listening in the background. I haven't looked into the details. But for me, the lack of transparency is a fundamental problem. Apple can say all day long, trust us, but when a lawsuit like this comes along, you realise how little oversight there really is. Now, in contrast to GrapheneOS, I use a Garmin Instinct 2 Solar Watch. Location tracking is turned off, notifications are turned off. I can control that, but I use Bluetooth to find my watch if I've lost it, and I can even find my phone from the watch if I lose the phone. Yeah, I'm clumsy, I do lose my phone from time to time. There's also an open source solution that I mentioned back in episode 6, which is Find My Device. I'll put a link in the show notes, and it's a genius way of finding the phone anywhere in the world, so that's great. I use Signal Messenger. I don't use Apple Pay or anything like that. I actually just use a good old-fashioned credit card. And as I've said in pretty much every episode, I use Nextcloud to synchronize everything. If you are still using an iPhone, this next section is for you. Now, you know I've talked plenty about iPhone privacy over the years. I've even admitted to using one myself in certain situations, like very recently when I was working in the hurricane-affected areas where having the ability to use the satellite communications mattered more to me than my usual privacy concerns, but that was temporary. Apple keeps pulling the same tricks, adding features that are turned on by default, features that quietly chip away at your privacy unless you know to go in and explicitly turn them off. Now, I'm not going to go through a comprehensive list, that would be a whole show on itself, but let's go through a few of these settings that Apple has decided to bake into iOS. Now, these are not settings that you'll find conveniently grouped under privacy and security in their settings menu. No, of course, Apple spreads them out, buries them in menus and hopes that you won't notice. Okay, first up, help Apple improve search. If you go to settings and then search, take a look. You'll probably find that feature is turned on. What this means is that every time you use Safari, your searches are being sent to Apple. And it's not just the search terms, contextual information too. So why is this not being listed under analytics and improvements? That's where you'd expect it to be. But no, it's tucked away in a different menu item. Most people won't look under search when they're looking at privacy settings, so I'd say go in there and turn it off. Next, Apple Intelligence and Siri, another sneaky one. If you head to Settings, Apple Intelligence and Siri, you'll see that Apple will have enabled Apple Intelligence by default. It's just another way of them collecting more data to personalize, in quotes, your experience. If you don't want that, you need to manually disable it. Now, while you're in Apple Intelligence and Siri, go ahead and turn off Talk to Siri and allow Siri when locked. All these features do is turn your iPhone into a surveillance device. I avoid it. Yes, it's convenient, but it also means Siri is constantly waiting and listening. This is not something I want running on any of my devices. Please turn them off. And another one I've seen, enhanced visual search in the Photos app. Apple is touting this as a privacy-preserving feature. It lets you search for your photos for landmarks or points of interest. Supposedly, it does this without giving Apple access to the content of your pictures. Now, they claim it uses technologies like homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, and OHTTP relays to hide your IP address and prevent them from learning about your photos. The core issue I have isn't just about the technical details or even the privacy implications. It's the lack of choice. Every time Apple or other companies like this enable features such as enhanced visual search by default, they're making the decision on behalf of their users, assuming we're okay with the trade-offs. This is what's so frustrating. It just takes control away from the individual and forces them into a system they did not explicitly agree to in the first place. I've always said privacy should always be opt-in, not opt-out. So, go to Settings, Apps, Photos, and turn off Enhanced Visual Search. Again, it's another setting they enabled by default. On a Mac, you'll find this under Photos, Settings, and General. Now, finally, scroll down to Settings, Apple Intelligence and Siri, and turn off all the suggestions Apple has enabled for you. Suggestions in Search, the lock screen, Safari, all these helpful suggestions are just another way for Apple to log and track what you're doing, in my opinion. Now, as I said, this is not a full walkthrough of all the privacy settings in iOS. My point here, these settings are ones that are turned on by default. They aren't listed where you expect to find them, and they're just frustrating. Apple knows what they're doing. They know the more data they collect, the more they can tailor their products and services, and the more valuable that data becomes. The key takeaway here is simple. You cannot rely on Apple or any big tech company for that matter to prioritize your privacy. You have to take control of it yourself. That means going through your settings, turning off features you don't need, and questioning every enhancement that supposedly makes your life easier. So go ahead, dig into those settings, turn off what you don't need. It's your data, they don't need it. Before I talk about AI, let's talk about home assistants. Whether it's Siri, Alexa, or Google Assistant, or some other version, these devices rely on constant listening. If they only activate when you say the wake word, well, they have to always be listening in the background. That's just how they work. You can't have a voice assistant without giving up some level of privacy, not unless it's running completely locally on your own servers. One day, perhaps we'll see that. Here's the thing. Even accidental activations are resulting in private conversations from being recorded and sent to servers. The recordings are analysed, sometimes by human beings. These companies are claiming this is to improve the service, but do you really believe they aren't mining that data for other purposes as well? Now, in Apple's case, people reported seeing targeted ads related to private conversations they had near a Siri-enabled device. This is the exact kind of surveillance capitalism I warn about on this show. And let me be clear, I don't recommend Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant or any voice assistant to anyone. Practical or not, they just don't deserve a place in my home. These devices are built on the premise of constant surveillance. They require you to trust companies who have consistently failed to prioritize your privacy. And the fact we even have to discuss accidental recordings at all just shows you how broken this model is. Is the convenience really worth sacrificing control over your most private conversations? For me, the answer is absolutely not. Now be bold, it's 2025. If you're still using an iPhone, even if you've got the latest model, just get rid of it. Turn it off, put it in the drawer, and let's look at GrapheneOS. It's the most private mobile OS available to customers today, in my opinion. I know there's other options, but it's the only one personally that I'd be willing to entertain. Now, privacy is a journey, not a destination. It's frustrating to see on Reddit and other places as well where people just give up because they couldn't achieve these extreme levels of privacy they once dreamed about. You're never going to reach extreme privacy, in my opinion. Not if you have a day job and a family and other people in your life. Just keep learning about all the tools and strategies that help you protect yourself. And what's right for me might not be right for you, and vice versa. But just being part of that journey is what matters. This isn't just about Siri or even Apple. It's about how much control you're willing to give up at the sake of convenience. Every device you bring into your home is either a tool for you or a tool for someone else to exploit you. Voice assistants, home assistants, whatever you want to call them, in my opinion, firmly fall into the second category. Now, I think what we're seeing, or what we're about to see, is a convergence of home assistants like Alexa and Siri and large language model chatbots like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Claude, and so on. Sure, they can write emails, they can generate ideas, they can create code, summarize articles, they can even simulate conversations with, Winston Churchill, whatever. We must assume that every interaction that we have with ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, whatever it is, generates a data trail. And that data trail won't just vanish. It's stored, it's analyzed, and it's often used to train the very models you're using. Now, personally, I use both ChatGPT and Claude. I'm very intentional and very careful. Now, personally, I use both ChatGPT and Claude. And for both of them, I have alias email addresses, alias names. I pay for that on privacy.com. Where they've needed phone verification, I've used a burner SIM that I've purchased for that purpose at the cheapest tariff with Tello, for example, and just let that expire. Now, let me tell you how I use each of them. Now, starting with ChatGPT. This is the one I use day to day, but I never give it my real name. So be careful, because let's say you wanted to review your resume and get suggestions on how to improve it. If you're going to do that, redact it first. Create another copy, take your name out, take any personally identifiable information out. That will include things like certification numbers, what university you went to, your address, all of that. You can redact enough to still improve the resume you have. ChatGPT is excellent at discussing, medical and labs results. Again, don't just give it those, because you're going to be giving it all your personal information. Now, it's extra work, but I sanitize everything I provide to ChatGPT. I think I've mentioned this before. I use Obsidian for my notes. They're hosted on Nextcloud, and I have a notes folder for ChatGPT, and I type things in there, and I keep a copy of it, and then I delete the chat as soon as I'm done. Now, I personally find Claude is exceptional at coding. Claude will burn up the usage limits much quicker than ChatGPT. So for that reason, I only use it for certain assistance with coding. I'm never giving it any personal information. And again, I have an alias account, so it doesn't ever get my real name. Now, I decided to dive into each of those in a bit more detail. So first with ChatGPT, if you go into the settings under data controls, you can turn off improve the model for everyone. Now, while you're at it, go into security and enable multi-factor authentication as well. You can also check under settings, personalization. There's a memory feature. Make sure to turn that off. And I'll link to their privacy policy in the show notes, but I want to just share this with you, because regardless of whether you delete those conversations and turn off the improving the model for everyone, this is what it says. We'll retain your personal data for only as long as we need in order to provide our services to you, or for other legitimate purposes such as resolving disputes, safety and security reasons, or complying with our legal obligations. How long we retain personal data will depend on a number of factors. And then they list things like the amount, the nature, the sensitivity of the information, and so on. And it says in some cases, the length of time we retain data depends on your settings. I read that as very ambiguous, so I would assume they keep your data forever. Again, be careful what you share with ChatGPT. One thing I did do, I emptied all my chats, I deleted everything. Then I went to settings, data controls, and clicked on export data. It only took a few minutes, probably because I don't have a vast amount in there, and I did get a zip file. And it included images, audio recordings, conversations in a JSON file, and also a chat.html, so you can open this up in your web browser. Now, interestingly, this did not include any of the chats I had deleted. So we must assume that their data export isn't providing you with everything they know about you. Now, Claude doesn't seem to have any privacy controls. So I looked at their privacy policy, and it says this: by default, we will not use your prompts and conversations from free or pro Claude UI to train our models. There are 2 instances in which we may use your prompts and conversations to train the models. One, if you give us explicit permission by submitting feedback through the thumbs up or down feature, or by reaching out to us with a request. And 2, where your prompts and conversations are flagged for trust and safety review. We may use or analyze those conversations to improve our ability to detect and enforce usage policy violations. Again, I would just assume they are keeping a history of everything. So I went to Settings, Account, and Export Data, and again you get a zip file. In this case, you get 2 files, users.json and conversations.json. Now, even if you've deleted all your chats in the UI, you still get those as part of the export. And I did this and found every chat since I opened the account back in March of 2024. And it does say that Anthropic, who run Claude, retained your personal data for as long as reasonably necessary for the purposes and criteria as outlined in their privacy policy. Now, in both ChatGPT and Claude exports, there was this users.json file, and both of them had the phone number, the email address, and the user ID, which is why I strongly recommend, if you're using any of those, is to have an alias email and a burner SIM number, not anything that's going to identify you. But you must assume they're going to know exactly who you are based on your chats, unless you are extremely careful. So just consider this. If you're sharing sensitive or proprietary information with any AI model, that data is likely and might end up as part of a training data set for future iterations of the model. Even if they claim they're not using the data for training, how do you verify that? I think this is just more headlines we're yet to see. This whole lack of transparency in how these systems operate, for me, is a huge red flag. And in many ways, the risks associated with AI chatbots are an extension of the issues we've discussed with voice assistants. Both require you to trust a third-party provider with your personal information. But here's the difference. AI assistants are often used for much deeper and more personal tasks. So please be careful. Okay, so my practical advice for using AI safely. First, limit what you share. Avoid inputting sensitive, proprietary or personal information. Treat them as public spaces. And also, if you can, look at local AI models. Now, I run a tool called LM Studio. It's very easy to use, and there's plenty more out there. There's Llama, GPT-based models you can download, and no data leaves your device. And as you know, I use Simple Wall to see on my Windows machine what's trying to access the internet. And by blocking LM Studio, I can be certain that nothing is leaking or leaving that device. Now, I know it's tedious, but read the privacy policies. I think understanding how your data will be used is essential before you engage with these platforms. Also, think about using temporary accounts. Maybe you've shared too much already. Perhaps delete the account, ask them to close it, and then create a new one under an alias. Use VPN, use a different phone number. Now, AI is certainly not going away. If anything, it's going to become more deeply embedded into our lives. And I think we're not going to be able to escape it. We're going to see it in our cars. We're going to see the merging of AI with home assistants. And I think this is why it's so critical to think about the long-term implications of using these tools. Every interaction you have with ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Claude, whatever it is, just adds to a growing data set. If you're not in control of how that data is used, someone else will be. Okay, lots to talk about in this show. So next, electric cars. You may have heard of an exploding Cybertruck outside the Trump building in Vegas. If you haven't been following the news, basically a Cybertruck was packed with fireworks and exploded on New Year's Day outside of a Trump building. I believe it killed a driver and injured several others. Now, Tesla, just like most modern car manufacturers, treats its vehicles like iPhones on wheels. They log everything: location, charging stops, there's in-cabin cameras, driving behaviour, and much, much more. That data can then be used in situations like this, where law enforcement needs to piece together what happened. But the problem is, this level of surveillance is always on. Yet again, it's not something you opt into or can even opt out of. The fact Tesla could track the driver's journey across multiple states in such detail and provide that to law enforcement within just a few hours highlights the sheer amount of data that these companies collect. But it really is not surprising, is it? It's one thing when law enforcement uses this data for a serious investigation, but what about when that data is abused? General Motors, for example, was sued last year for selling data from 1.8 million drivers to insurance companies without their consent. So if you drive one of those nice GMC Sierra pickup trucks, you are part of that data. And the problem is, it's not just the volume of data, it's the potential for abuse. What happens then when the insurance company decides to raise your rates based on where you drive, how often you brake, how hard you brake, and so on? Or perhaps when threat actors get access to this location history and the personal information because the data wasn't properly secured. And there's a story about that. Volkswagen, they have a software subsidiary called Cariad, and they recently had a massive data leak that exposed sensitive information from around 800,000 electric vehicles. This wasn't just some vague data like how many miles the car has done and service history and so on. They were logging detailed location data, essentially creating a map of people's movements, when they left their home, where they go to the gym, how long they're in the gym for, and so on. And if you've got a Volkswagen, Audi, Seat, Skoda, then your data might have been part of this leak. Now here's the part that really got to me. This data wasn't secured securely. It was sitting in an unprotected, unencrypted Amazon cloud bucket. Now, I worked at Amazon around 5 years ago. And even back then, it was incredibly hard to have a public Amazon S3 bucket by default. You have to intentionally go in and make it public. And even then, it comes up with all these warnings. So what on earth are Volkswagen doing, or their subsidiary anyway, having all this data in an unsecured bucket? I think this comes back down to poor security awareness among developers, and that's probably an entirely new podcast on its own. But just think about that. Anyone who knew where to look and had, and I would say, some very basic skills could have accessed all 800,000 records. In fact, reporters tested the leak and they were able to track 2 German politicians with their consent using the exposed data. Now, the leak affected 800,000 cars, but I think for 460,000 of them, that's models like the Volkswagen ID3 and ID4, the data was incredibly detailed. It wasn't just this car is in Germany, it was here it is exactly where the car was started, where it was stopped, your home address, your office, where you go for lunch, where you go to the gym, literally a roadmap of your life. And all of that was just sitting out there ready for anyone to use. And I think this is another wake-up call for anyone driving any modern car, not just an electric car, or at least thinking about buying a car, that these vehicles are packed with sensors, GPS, cameras, microphones, and software collecting an insane amount of information. It's not just where you drive, but it's how fast you drive, how often do you brake, how hard do you brake, do you use autopilot, are you looking out the window? Now, I know with Tesla, they have an interior cabin camera. You can put some electrical tape over that, and the only feature that will break is the full self-driving, which I believe costs money anyway. So if you don't use that, tape over the interior camera if you drive a Tesla. I think that's a good start. But look, it's not just the car companies. When you pair your phone with a vehicle, you're giving access to your contacts, your text messages, even your call logs. And if you're not careful, you're handing over your personal life to a machine that reports back to the mothership. What's worse is that most people don't even know this is happening. The convenience blinds them to the real cost. Now, this brings me back to why I rely so heavily on GrapheneOS and why I did an entire podcast episode on this topic. It was episode 3, and I called this The Invisible Net and why I use GrapheneOS. So when I'm in places like Las Vegas, I'm not syncing my location or any metadata with Google or Apple or any other ecosystem. And once that data's collected, you see, you can't undo it. Now, companies like Tesla may promise your data is secure, but let's not forget they're also the ones collecting it in the first place. Now, GrapheneOS is just one tool in my toolbox, but it's an important one. It helps me stay outside of the net, or at least as close to the edge as possible. So if you want to break free from this invisible net, GrapheneOS is a great place to start. I just wish there was a GrapheneOS electric car. That could be interesting. All right, back to Tesla. They have cameras pointed at the driver to monitor attentiveness. Useful for safety? Yeah, perhaps. Creepy? Absolutely. Now, charging stations, they're certainly a piece of the puzzle, aren't they? Most people probably don't realise this, but when you charge your car, data about your charging habits, like where and when you charge, how much energy you're using, and even your payment details is logged. Also, they're recording the video footage. If you have a Tesla and you're parked at the charging point, they're starting to record you in the car as well. Now, this is just another layer of surveillance that ties your car to your daily routine. Then the insurance companies, they're another player in this game. Now, with General Motors and some electric vehicle manufacturers, they already share driver data with insurers. Now, Tesla claims they don't sell telemetry data, as far as I know. If I'm wrong here, please email me. But I wouldn't assume this is going to be the case forever. If they can monetize this data, they will. Then there's law enforcement. Electric vehicles and modern cars make it easy for police and government agencies to request driving data. So location history, camera footage, and so on. Now, whether or not you're comfortable with that depends on your perspective, but it's a reminder of how much these cars know about you. Now, what really hit me about the Volkswagen leak is how preventable it was. This was not a sophisticated cyber attack. It was just the pure failure to secure the data properly, plain and simple. The fact it took a whistleblower to expose it and reporters could easily confirm the vulnerability just tells you everything we need to know about the lack of care companies take with our data. And once the data's out there, there is no going back to put it back in the bottle. That's the danger. Now, this should be a wake-up call for every car owner, and honestly, for anyone thinking about buying one. Now, honestly, these days, I don't think there's much difference between buying an electric car or a regular gasoline car. They're all spyware devices on wheels. And that's how I see it. Privacy doesn't stop when you leave the house. It follows you everywhere, even on the road. But it's up to us to make companies like Volkswagen know that we are watching them too. Now, to end the show, I want to bring up a topic around security and privacy and the overlap of the two. And this often gets overlooked, especially in the world of cybersecurity, and that is this connection between data breaches and personal privacy, and particularly how open source intelligence, or OSINT, plays a massive role in these attacks. A lot of companies are spending millions, honestly sometimes billions, on cybersecurity. They've got advanced next generation firewalls, intrusion detection systems, endpoint protection, you name it. And yet, breaches still happen. Why? Because no amount of technology can fully protect you if the human element is left exposed. Now, take the MGM and Caesars Palace ransomware attack a few years ago. These weren't successful because threat actors found some technical vulnerability buried in the server. They were successful because the attackers did their homework. They carried out reconnaissance, and a big part of that is OSINT. They were digging into publicly accessible information about the companies and their employees. And let's be clear, this is not a high-tech process. This just involves scrolling through LinkedIn, searching for IT staff, and figuring out who has access to what systems. Once they know who to target, it's game over. They'll craft a phishing email that looks like it's coming from a trusted source, maybe a fake message from the IT department asking for credentials, or they'll call the help desk pretending to be an employee locked out of their account, which is what happened in this case. Social engineering works because the attackers have done their research. They know who to impersonate. They know what tools the company uses, and even when employees are most likely to fall for the bait. And this is where the privacy angle comes in. Companies are focusing so much on protecting their networks and systems. They often overlook the fact that their employees' online presence is a goldmine for attackers. Every LinkedIn post, every public tweet, every conference bio, is all OSINT. And it's all being used to map out the organisation and find weak points. Now, I think companies need to integrate personal privacy awareness into their cybersecurity strategy. It's not enough to teach employees to avoid phishing emails or just to use strong passwords. They need to understand how the public-facing information can be weaponized against them. For example, maybe don't post on LinkedIn about the exact software stack you're using or the details of a recent system upgrade. It's just like handing the attackers a roadmap. And second, organizations need to think beyond compliance. Just because you're checking all the boxes for regulatory requirements doesn't mean they're secure. Privacy should be baked into the security plan, not treated as some afterthought. And this means conducting regular OSINT audits to see what information is out there about your company, about your employees, and about your systems. At the end of the day, if attackers can find it, so should you. And it really does frustrate me that most large enterprises have now defaulted to using the Microsoft 365 suite. So that's Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and so on. Attackers can use this as part of their phishing campaigns with great success. Quote from Borat there, because it's so damn predictable. Along with first.last@companyname.com on LinkedIn, for example, you can see how easy it is to target these users. And now can you see how OSINT is just completely overlooked? Now, my advice to companies is just one practical step. Just limit the amount of personal information your employees share online. Encourage them to keep their LinkedIn profiles vague when it comes to specific job roles or the tools they use. For the companies themselves, consider removing or even anonymizing team bios on the website. Sure, it's nice to showcase talent, but it also makes these people targets. The bottom line is this: cybersecurity and privacy are not separate issues. They're two sides of the same coin. You can have the best security tools in the world, but if attackers can use OSINT to bypass all of that and then exploit the people, then as an organization, you're still vulnerable. The MGM and Caesars attacks are perfect examples of how the human element is the weakest link. And I think it's time that organizations stop treating privacy as a regulatory requirement and a checkbox and started integrating it into the core of security strategies. Well, I'm getting a sore throat. I've done enough talking for the new year. I will leave it there and talk to you very soon.